Throughout history, few events have left as deep and lasting a mark as the Second World War. Beyond the battlefields and the tragic loss of millions of lives, the conflict became a dark stage for the most extreme scientific and technological experimentation. In this context, Nazi Germany carried out some of the most disturbing and secretive projects ever conceived, many of which defied the boundaries of ethics, science, and reason. In this investigation, we delve into the most unsettling discoveries made under the Third Reich regime, revelations that not only shocked the world at the time, but continue to send chills to this day. What they discovered in Nazi Germany terrified the world. A city beneath the surface, secret Nazi bunkers. The origin of the Wolf's Lair dates back to 1940, when Hitler ordered its construction as a secret headquarters for preparing the invasion of the Soviet Union. Over time, the complex grew to include around 200 buildings, including bunkers, shelters, and barracks, occupied by more than 2,000 people at its peak. Later, more bunkers were created throughout occupied Europe. In 1944, as Allied forces advanced toward the heart of Nazi Germany, they expected to find conventional military infrastructure, air bases, barracks, weapons factories, and logistics centers. What they did not anticipate was the existence of a hidden underground world stretching from city to city, revealing a completely unknown dimension of the Third Reich's war effort. Beneath the German surface, they discovered vast networks of interconnected bunkers that extended for kilometers, chilling evidence of the level of preparation with which the regime planned to resist until its final breath. As they entered these facilities, soldiers described an almost spectral sensation, time capsules frozen in place, intact, as if their occupants had abandoned them just a few hours earlier. The most well-known of these shelters was the Führer bunker, the underground complex located beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, where Adolf Hitler spent his final days. This structure, almost fortress-like in nature, included residential areas, administrative offices, and enough provisions to withstand a prolonged siege, reflecting the degree of isolation and desperation in which the regime found itself in its final moments. However, what was found in Berlin was only a sample of the reach of this underground architecture. In regions such as Bavaria, Allied troops discovered immense tunnel systems and hidden factories carved into the interiors of mountains or concealed within dense forests. These were not mere air raid shelters, but true underground cities designed to house scientific research facilities, command centers, and industrial weapons plants, all carefully protected from Allied bombings. The magnitude, complexity, and sophistication of these constructions amazed even the most experienced military engineers. They not only evidenced the intention to prolong the war indefinitely, but also suggested that the Third Reich had contemplated the possibility of continuing its fight from underground, even if it lost control of the surface. This strategy, as desperate as it was visionary, left an indelible impression on those who witnessed those silent and dark labyrinths beneath defeated Germany. The lost treasures of the Nazis. After the definitive defeat of Nazi Germany in 1945, while the ruins of the Third Reich still smoldered under the weight of destruction, one of the most intense, mysterious, and thrilling hunts in modern history began, the search for the hidden treasures of the National Socialist regime. During the years of occupation and conquest, the Nazis not only focused on expanding their territorial domain, but also carried out a systematic and meticulous plundering of Europe's economic and cultural resources. They turned looting into a state policy. They seized billions in gold, currency, jewels, and works of art. Museums, banks, libraries, churches, and private homes were stripped without hesitation. No one and nothing was safe from the voracious appetite of an ideological machine that valued both symbolic and material power. As Allied troops penetrated the heart of the Reich, they began to encounter increasingly disturbing clues. Amid the chaos of the German retreat, they discovered camouflaged vaults, abandoned trains, lost cargo, secret tunnels, and sealed bunkers, many of them filled with confiscated treasures. However, among all the findings, one of the most astonishing took place in the center of Germany, in the Merkers salt mine in the state of Thuringia. In March of 1945, soldiers of the Third United States Army, under the command of General George S. Patton, entered this underground complex while securing the area. What they found there left them speechless. A gigantic armored chamber, hidden more than 600 meters underground, contained a true Nazi war booty. More than 100 tons of gold bars, stored in perfectly organized rows, along with piles of banknotes, foreign coins, precious stones, financial documents, boxes full of jewelry, and, perhaps most strikingly, countless works of art stolen from the great museums of Europe and private collections, many of them taken from Jewish families deported to concentration camps. The estimated value of what was found in Merkers translates in current terms into billions of dollars. But beyond the figures, the discovery was compelling proof that the Nazi regime had planned not only to fund its war through looting, but also to secure sufficient resources for a possible future restructuring of power, even after a potential military defeat. However, the most disturbing part was not what was found, but what was not. This discovery raised a question that to this day continues to spark intrigue, investigations, and theories. If this was only one of the depots, how many more existed? Where is the rest of the gold? How many masterpieces of European art remain hidden in caves, sealed bunkers, or illegal private collections? Could much of the continent's cultural legacy have disappeared forever? These questions gave rise to a race against time to recover the lost heritage. Governments, art historians, military forces, researchers, and treasure hunters launched efforts to trace the movements of stolen artworks and Nazi gold. Some pieces were recovered and returned to their rightful owners, but many others have never resurfaced. It is suspected that some were destroyed, others sold on the black market, and many still remain hidden, waiting to be rediscovered. The story of the hidden treasures of the Third Reich not only reveals the magnitude of the looting perpetrated by the regime, but also the predatory and meticulously planned nature of its imperialist expansion. And at the same time, it reminds us that war not only destroys bodies and cities, but also memories, legacies, and entire cultures. To this day, every missing painting and every vanished gold bar remain silent symbols of a past whose shadow still extends over the present. The Type XXI U-boat. During the early years of the Second World War, the naval power of the Third Reich found its most lethal and silent form in the depths of the Atlantic Ocean. The German U-boats, feared submarines of the Kriegsmarine, launched a devastating campaign against Allied maritime routes, plunging convoys into a constant state of vulnerability. Their objective was clear: to strangle Great Britain and weaken the Soviet war effort by cutting off the supply of food, weapons, oil, and strategic material crossing the North Atlantic from the United States and Canada. This fierce struggle, known as the Battle of the Atlantic, became a war of attrition where every sunken ship was a direct wound to the Allied logistical heart. However, toward the end of the conflict in 1945, the Allied forces came across an unexpected and unsettling discovery while occupying German territory. Among the captured technical documents, shipyards, and naval bases, evidence emerged of a new generation of submarines that, had it been deployed on a large scale, could have radically altered the course of the war: the Type XXI U-boat. This class of submarines was not a simple evolution of its predecessors. It represented a complete break from the traditional design of U-boats from the First and Second World Wars. While previous models were essentially surface ships that could submerge for limited periods and were therefore vulnerable during most of their operations, the Type XXI was the first submarine truly designed for permanent underwater warfare. Its conception was based on the premise that a submarine's natural environment should not be the surface, but the depths of the sea, a habitat where invisibility made it the perfect weapon. The Type XXI U-boat was built with a revolutionary design. Its elongated and streamlined hull was optimized for submerged navigation, not for the surface. It incorporated powerful battery banks, twice the capacity of any previous submarine, allowing it to operate submerged for several days, something never seen before. This level of underwater autonomy rendered Allied detection systems such as active sonar practically useless, as the submarine could remain submerged far beyond the reach of anti-submarine patrols. Moreover, its underwater speed, even greater than that of many escort destroyers, meant it could attack stealthily and retreat without being intercepted. Another of its key innovations was its torpedo reload system. Unlike conventional U-boats, the Type XXI could reload and fire all its torpedo tubes in just minutes, allowing it to launch multiple attacks in rapid succession. The threat it posed was not theoretical. Had these lethal machines been deployed in sufficient numbers in the middle of the conflict, Allied convoys would have been completely vulnerable, which could have jeopardized the logistical effort toward Europe, altered the planning of D-Day, and considerably prolonged the war. Allied intelligence officers and naval high command were deeply alarmed when evaluating the captured blueprints and prototypes. The development of the Type XXI had been surrounded by extreme secrecy. At the time of Germany's surrender, a few models were in test service and others were in various stages of assembly. They did not arrive in time to change the outcome of the conflict, but they left an indelible impression. The future of naval warfare had just been revealed in the shipyards of the defeated enemy. The legacy of the Type XXI U-boat was not limited to the fear it inspired in its discoverers. Its influence was immediate and profound. Both the United States and the Soviet Union studied and copied its designs for the development of their own post-war submarine fleets. The Type XXI became the technological seed that would give rise to the modern attack submarines of the Cold War. Thus, this discovery was not simply a testament to the Third Reich's technical capability, but a chilling reminder of how close the world came to facing an even more prolonged, stealthy, and lethal war beneath the waves. The advance of the Enigma Code, the Nazi encryption that almost won the war. For much of the Second World War, the German High Command operated under the firm belief that it possessed an unquestionable strategic advantage, a machine that turned its military communications into an unbreakable code. This machine, known as Enigma, was the central axis of the Third Reich's communication infrastructure, used to coordinate everything from U-boat tactics in the Atlantic to troop movements on the Eastern Fronts and North Africa. For the Nazis, Enigma was not just a tool, it was a guarantee that their network of orders, transmissions, and operational secrets was completely out of enemy reach. The functioning of Enigma was, in fact, extraordinarily complex. At first glance, the machine resembled a portable typewriter, but inside it housed an intricate system of electromechanical rotors, interchangeable connections, and internal circuits that reconfigured each keystroke into a unique encrypted sequence. The key to the system lay in the fact that each day, and sometimes even every few hours, the machine's configuration systematically changed, allowing for more than 150 million possible combinations. Without knowing the exact daily key and the precise rotor configuration, deciphering a message encoded by Enigma was virtually impossible. This sense of cryptographic invulnerability gave Germany a reckless confidence in its communications. Messages were frequently transmitted by radio in the belief that even if intercepted, they would remain incomprehensible to the enemy. For the Allies, this posed a serious problem. Unable to decipher the contents of German transmissions, they were incapable of anticipating attacks, protecting vital supply convoys, or responding to key maneuvers by Axis forces. However, in the invisible margins of the conflict, a completely different battle was being waged in absolute secrecy. In a rural and discreet place north of London called Bletchley Park, a group of mathematicians, linguists, engineers, and logic experts worked tirelessly to break the code Germany considered unbreakable. Leading this effort was Alan Turing, a young British mathematician whose unconventional ideas, brilliant intellect, and reserved demeanor would make him one of the most crucial and tragically underestimated figures of the entire war. Turing and his team understood that trying to manually solve Enigma's combinations was a doomed endeavor. Instead, they turned to early computational engineering. Thus was born the bomb, an electromechanical machine capable of systematically analyzing Enigma's possible daily configurations at a speed impossible for humans. Using logical assumptions called cribs and taking advantage of common mistakes made by German operators, such as repeating message fragments or using predictable greetings, the bombe drastically reduced the time required to decrypt messages. Once they began regularly deciphering German transmissions, the impact was overwhelming. The Allies gained direct access to the core of the enemy's strategic thinking. They knew in advance the exact positions of the U-boats in the Atlantic, allowing convoys to avoid devastating ambushes. They discovered plans for land offensives before they were executed, altering the course of key battles like El Alamein in Africa and contributing decisively to the success of the Normandy landings in 1944. They even intercepted direct orders from Adolf Hitler, whose growing paranoia, lack of information, and erratic decisions were now exposed. This flow of intelligence, which the British codenamed Ultra, not only shortened the war, according to some historians, by at least 2 years, but also saved millions of lives. And yet the greatest secret of the war was never revealed to the public at the time. For fear that knowledge of the Enigma break would compromise future operations or alert other potential enemies, the project was classified at the highest level. Many of the soldiers, officers, and even Allied generals who acted during the conflict never knew that their victories depended on a handful of codebreakers working silently in a country house in England. It was not until decades later, in the 1970s, that the existence of Ultra and Turing's work were finally recognized. By then, Alan Turing was already dead, the victim of state persecution for his sexual orientation, despite having been one of the invisible architects of the Allied victory. Today, the episode of Enigma is not only remembered as an unprecedented technical feat, but also as an example of how human intellect, perseverance, and innovation can tip the scales of history, even in its darkest hours. The Indestructible Tiger and King Tiger tanks. Throughout the Second World War, the battlefield witnessed a fierce technological race between the warring nations. Military engineers, aware that tactical superiority could depend on a single innovation, constantly developed deadlier weapons, stronger armor, and faster vehicles. In this context, a war machine emerged that, from the moment of its debut, instilled unusual fear among Allied ranks. The Panzerkampfwagen 6 Tiger, known simply as the Tiger tank. When Allied troops first encountered the Tiger I during the North African campaigns in 1942 and later on the Eastern Front, they were forced to completely rethink their armored strategy. Until then, enemy tanks could be fought with conventional anti-tank weapons or by using numerical superiority tactics. However, the Tiger represented an entirely new class of threat. Its imposing silhouette, nearly impenetrable armor, and long-range cannon transformed the dynamics of ground combat. The Tiger was protected by up to 100 millimeters of frontal armor, making it almost invulnerable to Allied shells fired from the front, even at close range. Often, the shells from Sherman or T-34 tank cannons simply bounced off without causing any damage, generating a deep sense of helplessness among Allied crews. In contrast, the Tiger was armed with the formidable 88mm KWK 36L/56 gun, a modified version of the famous German anti-aircraft cannon that had already proven its lethal capability against armored targets. This weapon could destroy enemy tanks at distances greater than 2 kilometers, long before opponents could respond or even identify its location. Combat accounts abound about the Tiger's devastating effectiveness. Entire platoons of Allied tanks were neutralized with a single accurate shot, while the survivors could only maneuver desperately to attack the flanks or rear of the Colossus, where its armor was somewhat more vulnerable. In many cases, the mere presence of a Tiger on the battlefield was enough to halt an advance, forcing Allied commanders to divert forces, heavy artillery, and even air support just to neutralize one of these armored monsters. But if the Tiger spread panic, its successor, the Tiger II, officially known as Königstiger or King Tiger, introduced in 1944, brought terror to a new level. Larger, more heavily armored, and even more powerful, the King Tiger featured a design with sloped armor plates up to 185 millimeters thick at the front, making it virtually invulnerable from any frontal angle. Its new gun, the 88mm KWK 43L/71, had even greater range and superior penetration capacity, capable of piercing the armor of any Allied tank with ease. The King Tiger was, in many respects, a mobile fortress. Its mere appearance on the Western fronts, such as in Normandy and during the Ardennes offensive, caused alarm among Allied commanders. Entire units were decimated before they even had a clear line of fire. In some battles, King Tigers ambushed squadrons of Sherman tanks, destroying them within minutes without taking any damage. However, this power came at a cost. The King Tiger was enormously expensive to manufacture, demanded many resources, and was complex to maintain. Its great weight made it vulnerable in muddy terrain or areas with weak infrastructure. Even so, the threat it posed was so significant that the Allies developed specific tactics and weapons to confront them, including airstrikes with fighter bombers, coordinated ambushes, and the use of heavy artillery. For many Allied soldiers, the Tiger was not just another enemy tank. It was an almost mythical force, a war machine that seemed to emerge from nowhere, annihilate, and vanish into the fog of battle. Its legacy endures not only in military history books, but also in the collective memory of a generation that faced it, knowing that in many cases there was no possible escape if a Tiger had them in its sights. The chilling discovery of Nazi medical experiments. When Allied forces finally broke through the last bastion of Nazi Germany in 1945, they knew that what they would find behind the barbed wires of the concentration camps would be terrifying. They had heard rumors, stories whispered by freed prisoners, vague reports from the resistance about the extent of suffering within those places. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared them for the reality they found. What they discovered was not merely death or misery. It was the irrefutable proof of a horror systematically designed, meticulously executed, and scientifically codified. Medical experimentation on human beings on an industrial scale. Among the most tragically infamous camps were Auschwitz, Dachau, and Ravensbrück. These were not only centers of extermination and forced labor, but also the setting for one of the regime's most atrocious facets, the use of human beings, many of them children, women, and people with disabilities, as subjects of inhuman medical testing. In laboratories hidden among barracks and medical wards, experiments of unimaginable brutality were carried out under the pretense of scientific advances or military improvements. One name etched in horror in the history of humanity is that of Dr. Josef Mengele, the so-called Angel of Death. From his post at Auschwitz, Mengele became the central figure of a regime of scientific torture disguised as medical research. Obsessed with genetics, race, and eugenics, Mengele selected twins, children, and people with deformities to subject them to horrific experiments, injections of chemical substances into their eyes to change their color, unnecessary amputations, organ transplants, forced transfusions, tests of resistance to extreme cold, and deliberate exposure to diseases without treatment, all without anesthesia and without consent. But Mengele was not the only one. In Ravensbrück, female prisoners were used to test bone regeneration methods, resistance to infections, or the effects of toxic gases. In Dachau, hypothermia experiments were conducted by submerging prisoners in ice-cold water for hours to test the limits of human survival. These practices were not isolated acts of sadism. They were part of official policy legitimized by the highest levels of the Third Reich. Even soldiers hardened by years of war were deeply marked by what they found. Many were unable to hold back tears. Others vomited upon seeing the remains of the experiments, the living scars on the bodies of survivors, the photographs, the medical reports written in cold and impersonal clinical language. These discoveries eliminated any remaining doubt about the true nature of the Nazi regime. The cruelty had not been limited to battlefields, nor even to political repression. It had become a scientific program with human victims. The global outrage over these crimes led to the Nuremberg trials, where many of the Nazi doctors responsible were prosecuted in the so-called Doctors' Trial in 1947. It was there that the world formally recognized the urgent need to establish ethical limits in medical research, giving rise to the Nuremberg Code, a set of principles that today forms the foundation of modern bioethics. Among them, the voluntary consent of the subject, the prohibition of unnecessary experiments, and the obligation to minimize suffering. That dark chapter of history not only showed the depths of dehumanization that can be reached under a totalitarian regime, but also set in motion a moral and ethical revolution in science. At the cost of unspeakable suffering, humanity learned a lesson it should never forget, that knowledge without ethics is not progress, but barbarism. The lost library of the Third Reich, hidden knowledge or destroyed forever. Among the many enigmas that emerged after the collapse of the Third Reich in 1945, few proved as puzzling and symbolically charged as the disappearance of a vast and enigmatic collection of books, manuscripts, and classified documents, the so-called Lost Library of the Third Reich. It is estimated that more than 3 million volumes, including ancient texts, esoteric treatises, academic literature, and secret archives, vanished without a trace during the final chaotic days of Hitler's regime. But this was no ordinary library. It was a carefully curated compendium by the Nazi ideological and scientific apparatus, an accumulation of knowledge intended not only to preserve the Reich's power, but to transform it into an eternal empire rooted in the occult, science, and symbolism. During the Second World War, specialized units of the regime, such as the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, an organization dedicated to cultural looting, scoured the continent, plundering university libraries, archives of Masonic lodges, private collections of Jewish scholars, centers for Oriental studies, and ancient monasteries. The Nazis were convinced that forbidden knowledge held the keys to spiritual and ideological domination. At the behest of Heinrich Himmler and other high-ranking officials, they sought texts on alchemy, astrology, Aryanism, lost civilizations, Gnostic writings, Hermetic knowledge, and arcane symbolism. In parallel, they also gathered advanced scientific studies, racial theories, weaponry engineering models, and classified documentation from occupied countries. The ultimate purpose was to create the most powerful library ever conceived, an absolute archive of academic, mystical, political, and pseudoscientific knowledge that could support the new world order the Third Reich aspired to build. Many of these works were stored in hidden locations such as Bavarian castles, abandoned monasteries, and underground bunkers far from bombings and prying eyes. Himmler, for instance, envisioned turning Wewelsburg Castle into the spiritual center of the SS and the symbolic core of this Aryan knowledge library. However, with Germany's impending defeat and the fall of Berlin, the traces of this library began to disappear. Some sections were secretly moved, others were possibly destroyed deliberately to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. When Allied forces arrived at many of the supposed locations, they found empty rooms, broken catalogues, and scattered books. Other shipments are believed to have been hidden in mines, armored trains, or underground tunnels, whose access was sealed or destroyed. To this day, the final fate of much of that collection remains a mystery. Some books reappeared in university libraries in Eastern Europe or in Soviet archives, where they remained hidden for decades. Others may still lie underground, lost among ruins of concrete and steel, waiting to be rediscovered. What is clear is that this library, beyond its documentary value, represented the Nazi regime's obsession with controlling not only the present, but also the past and future of human knowledge. Ultimately, the disappearance of this collection is one of the most unsettling symbols of the Third Reich's intellectual legacy. A systematic attempt to manipulate knowledge to justify tyranny, conquest, and extermination. And its loss raises questions that still resonate today. What secrets did it contain? Where is it now, and what would happen if someone found it? The Nazi cultivation of an ancient race, the Aryan supermen, and the quest for their lost lineage. At the heart of the Third Reich's ideology pulsed an idea as dangerous as it was obsessive, the belief in the supremacy of the Aryan race, conceived as a pure, noble, and superior lineage destined to dominate the world. For the architects of the Nazi regime, this notion was not merely a propaganda tool or a justification for racial exclusion. It was a pseudo-scientific and nearly mystical vision that aimed to shape the future of humanity. According to this conception, Aryans not only possessed supposed biological superiority in terms of strength, intellect, and morality, but also descended from an ancient and forgotten civilization whose roots were lost in the mists of time. The Nazi obsession with finding these mythical ancestors went beyond the boundaries of conventional science and ventured into the realms of speculative archaeology, comparative mythology, and occultism. Convinced that the key to restoring Aryan greatness lay in recovering a lost ancestral lineage, leaders such as Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS and a fervent believer in esoteric doctrines, funded expeditions to remote regions of the world, from Tibet to Scandinavia, from the Bavarian Alps to the ruins of the Eastern Mediterranean. One of the myths that most fascinated the ideological and esoteric circles of the regime was that of Atlantis. The Nazis reinterpreted Plato's legend of this advanced and vanished civilization as the true origin of the Aryan race. According to this vision, the Atlanteans possessed technological, spiritual, and biological knowledge superior to any known civilization, and their lineage had survived among the peoples of Northern Europe, especially in Germany. This connection to the mythical was no accident. It granted them a divine and ancestral legitimacy and justified the territorial expansion and eugenics project of the Third Reich as a return to a lost golden age. To reinforce these beliefs, the SS created institutions such as the Ahnenerbe, Ancestral Heritage, an organization dedicated to tracing and reconstructing the history, traditions, and symbols of this supposed Aryan lineage. Under its umbrella, anthropological research, studies on Germanic runes, cranial measurements, archaeological excavations, and analyses of medieval texts were conducted, all with the purpose of proving the continuity of a superior racial heritage from antiquity to the Nazi present. The problem, and the danger, was that these searches were not guided by scientific rigor, but by racial ideology and a dangerous blend of mythology, pseudoscience, and mysticism. Findings were often manipulated, forcibly interpreted, or outright invented to fit the Aryan narrative. History became a tool in the service of power, and archaeology an instrument of propaganda. This search for a race of supermen with roots in a legendary past not only inspired policies of extermination and genetic engineering programs like Lebensborn, but also underpinned a regime that saw itself not as a political force, but as the rebirth of a lost world order. A 1,000-year Reich that, according to them, resumed the legacy of a vanished and superior civilization. Today, with the distance of time and the weight of historical evidence, this vision is terrifying not only for its genocidal consequences, but for the human capacity to manipulate history, science, and myth to justify the greatest atrocities in the name of an idea, that of a purity that never existed. The Nazi nuclear nightmare. During the course of the Second World War, the Allied forces made one of the most disturbing and revealing discoveries that marked not only the outcome of the conflict, but also the global understanding of the scope and ambition of the Nazi regime. For years there had been speculation about the German efforts to develop nuclear weapons. There was a strong suspicion, though without definitive confirmation, that Adolf Hitler and his scientists were committed to building the atomic bomb, the ultimate weapon capable of irreversibly tipping the balance of the war. It was not until Allied troops began advancing into German territory and uncovering clandestine facilities that the true magnitude of these efforts came to light. Secret laboratories and research centers were found hidden in remote and strategic locations, such as the mountains of Norway, where nature protected these sites. In them, under a veil of extreme secrecy, a group of elite Nazi scientists, led by physicist Werner Heisenberg, was engaged in a frantic race to master atomic power. Their research focused on uranium enrichment and the use of heavy water, an essential moderator for nuclear reactors, with the clear and terrifying goal of producing a nuclear bomb. These discoveries confirmed that the Nazi regime was not merely theorizing or exploring advanced scientific ideas, but was already in an advanced stage of developing a weapon that, if completed, would have had the capacity to radically change the course of the war and history itself. The possibility that Hitler could have possessed an atomic bomb ignited an apocalyptic scenario. Entire cities like London, Moscow, or even Washington could have been destroyed in seconds, annihilating millions of lives and leaving behind an unprecedented legacy of devastation. The atmosphere of tension and mystery surrounding these atomic programs persisted for decades, fueling debates among historians and scientists about how close Nazi Germany truly came to obtaining a functional nuclear weapon. Some argue that the project lacked sufficient resources and time to result in an operational weapon, while others warn that with just a few more months, the world would have faced a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. What is certain is that this episode underscores the dangerous intersection between the ideological ambition of a totalitarian regime and the technological advances of its time. The race for the atomic bomb not only symbolizes a technological milestone, but also a grim warning about the consequences of science in the service of destructive goals. Had Nazi Germany succeeded in completing its atomic bomb, the history of the Second World War and perhaps of the modern world, would have been forever marked by a catastrophic and grim outcome. Dark indoctrination. After the end of the Second World War, one of the most disturbing and revealing discoveries for the Allied forces was the magnitude of the systematic indoctrination to which German youth had been subjected under the Nazi regime. It was not merely about instilling respect or admiration for Adolf Hitler as the supreme leader, but about a meticulously orchestrated process that shaped an entire generation from early childhood with the aim of creating fanatical soldiers, loyal informants, and unconditional followers of a totalitarian and violent ideology. The youth organizations of the Third Reich, particularly the Hitler Youth for Boys and the League of German Girls for Girls, were not mere clubs or extracurricular activities. They were true factories of ideological loyalty, designed to eliminate any form of critical thinking and to build a rigid and absolute mindset that glorified extreme nationalism, racial supremacy, and blind obedience to the Nazi Party. From a very young age, these youths were introduced into a world of constant propaganda, rituals, and teachings whose purpose was to bind their identity irrevocably to the Reich. But the indoctrination was not limited to these youth groups. German schools were transformed into living propaganda tools. The traditional curriculum was replaced by textbooks that, under the guise of formal education, transmitted a distorted version of history, science, and morality in which the superiority of the Aryan race was exalted, war and conquest were justified, and military strategy was taught as an integral part of the young people's education. Teachers who showed resistance to this model were persecuted, expelled, or imprisoned, leaving the educational system fully aligned with the regime's vision. The most terrifying aspect of this process was revealed in the final days of the war, when the unstoppable advance of the Allied forces toward Berlin exposed the desperation of the Nazi regime. Faced with the near-total disappearance of experienced soldiers, dead, captured, or fleeing, the Third Reich's last line of defense was made up of children and teenagers who had been trained for years to be fanatical soldiers. The world was horrified to learn the stories of children as young as 12 years old taking up arms, some still wearing their school uniforms, facing professional and experienced troops with outdated rifles and trembling hands. When captured, many of these youths not only refused to surrender. Some spat at their captors, shouted Nazi slogans, and in a final act of fanaticism begged to be executed rather than betray the ideals in which they had been indoctrinated. These scenes demonstrated the tragic and terrifying success of a system that had shaped young minds to believe that dying for Hitler and the Reich was the highest imaginable honor, a supreme sacrifice that justified any horror. The depth and extent of this indoctrination left an indelible mark on collective memory, reminding us how ideological manipulation can transform entire generations into blind instruments of a devastating cause. The Nazi gold train, a buried treasure or a wartime hoax. During the final months of the Second World War, a rumor began to circulate that captured the imagination of intelligence agencies, treasure hunters, and adventurers alike. The legend spoke of an armored train, loaded to the brim with gold jewels, priceless artifacts, and looted riches which mysteriously disappeared in the depths of Lower Silesia as Soviet forces advanced relentlessly through Poland. According to the accounts that spread, Nazi officers, in a desperate act to save the spoils accumulated over years of occupation and looting, had loaded this train with an incalculable fortune. Billions in gold stolen from European banks, valuables taken from museums and private individuals, and especially goods confiscated from Jewish victims and other persecuted populations. All this treasure had previously been channeled to secret storage complexes like Mittelwerk, a vast underground network in Germany, but it was claimed that this final shipment, perhaps the last great fortune of the Reich, was transferred and buried forever in an even more inaccessible location. The legend pointed to the Owl Mountains in the region that today belongs to Poland as the site where this train disappeared into a network of tunnels and caverns hidden from the eyes of the world. Since then, the mystery of the lost train has remained one of the most intriguing and persistent enigmas of the post-war era, fueled by partial testimonies, declassified documents, and failed expeditions that attempted unsuccessfully to locate that mythical loot. This tale, at the crossroads between history and myth, represents not only the extreme greed and massive looting perpetrated by the Third Reich, but also the enduring human obsession with uncovering secrets buried under the dust of a conflict that forever changed the fate of Europe. The Nazi persecution of artificial intelligence. Another of the most unsettling and often overlooked discoveries related to the technological legacy of the Third Reich was the early exploration of concepts we now associate with artificial intelligence. Although the term AI did not exist as such in the 1940s, the principles underlying it were already beginning to take shape in the minds of certain German scientists, visionaries, and engineers who worked under the pressure of a regime obsessed with technological superiority and total domination. Driven by the urgency of an increasingly desperate war, the Nazis not only invested in conventional weaponry, but also began to explore radical technologies ahead of their time. Among these efforts was the idea of automated systems capable of processing information, adapting to changing environments, and making decisions without direct human intervention. This concept, which today forms the core of artificial intelligence, was then emerging in embryonic form, but already revealed an unsettling vision: the possibility of creating thinking machines for military and control purposes. One of the most revealing projects in this area was the development of the Z3, built by engineer Konrad Zuse in 1941. Considered one of the first programmable computers in the world, the Z3 operated using electromechanical relays and was capable of performing complex mathematical operations by following coded instructions. Although initially conceived as a tool to solve technical calculations in aeronautical engineering, its existence represented a quantum leap in the history of computing. Beyond its technical limitations, what made the Z3 truly revolutionary was the underlying principle: the creation of a machine that executed instructions without direct supervision, a direct precursor to the algorithmic thinking that defines modern AI. It was not the only effort. Documents and prototypes were found suggesting that automatic control systems were also explored for weapons, guided missiles, and anti-aircraft defense networks that responded in real time to environmental stimuli. This rudimentary form of automated reaction could be considered a distant ancestor of current machine learning and autonomous response systems. The most disturbing aspect of all this is that these investigations did not arise solely from a desire for military efficiency, but from a totalitarian ideology that aspired to build a system of absolute control. In the hands of the Third Reich, the possibility of machines not only performing tasks, but also making decisions opened up a dark horizon, that of a dehumanized war conducted by soulless devices in service of a ruthless regime. Although the war halted these premature developments, many of the scientists involved were later integrated into the technological programs of the victorious powers as part of the well-known Operation Paperclip in the United States. Thus, the seeds planted under the Nazi regime, for profoundly disturbing motivations, found fertile ground in the post-war technological race, influencing the evolution of cybernetics, automation, and eventually the artificial intelligence that is now beginning to transform the world. That little-known chapter of the Second World War reminds us that even the brightest advances can be born from the shadows, and that science, stripped of ethics, can become a tool of oppression and destruction. The secret Nazi escape lines, how war criminals disappeared into the shadows. As the Third Reich crumbled under the weight of its own arrogance and the relentless pressure of the Allied forces, the world watched with anticipation the collapse of the most brutal regime of the 20th century. It was expected that the main architects of the horror, the top Nazi officials responsible for the Holocaust, the extermination camps, the massacres, and the repressive apparatus of terror would be captured, tried, or killed in combat. But as Allied troops advanced into the final bastions of the Reich, a puzzling phenomenon emerged. Some of the most dangerous figures of the Third Reich simply vanished. SS generals, high-ranking Gestapo officers, scientists involved in human experiments, and commanders of death squads seemed to have disappeared from the face of the earth. They were not among the prisoners, did not appear in the camps, and were not found among the dead after the battles. The reality that later came to light was even more disturbing than any improvised escape. These men had not fled by chance, but through a complex and well-organized clandestine network known as the Rat Lines. These secret escape routes, woven in the shadows and sustained by a combination of Nazi sympathizers, clergy, complicit diplomatic networks, and even sectors of Western intelligence, allowed hundreds, perhaps thousands, of Nazi war criminals to evade justice. From the ruins of Germany, many traveled with false identities through Italy, Spain, or Switzerland, until reaching safe havens in South America, particularly in Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Chile. Some even managed to build new lives, living comfortably for decades under false names, with passports provided by organizations such as the International Red Cross, often without being disturbed by international justice. The impact of these revelations was devastating. How was it possible that the perpetrators of the worst crimes of the century could so systematically avoid punishment? Who protected them? Why were they ignored by so many for so long? The scandal grew even greater when it was revealed that certain Western intelligence services, primarily in the context of the Cold War, had recruited former Nazi scientists for strategic projects such as missile development or nuclear programs in exchange for immunity. The existence of the Rat Lines not only undermined confidence in the international institutions created after the war to prevent another barbarity, but also sowed disturbing doubts about the sincerity of denazification. It became clear that, while the entire world swore that the horrors of Nazism would neither be forgotten nor forgiven, pacts of silence and complicity were being forged in the shadows for political or ideological convenience. Even today, decades later, the full extent of the Rat Lines remains unclear. Sporadic reports continue to emerge about hidden Nazi enclaves, concealed identities, and remnants of the Third Reich's apparatus hidden in distant lands. The recent late discoveries of some elderly war criminals have served as a reminder that impunity, in certain cases, persisted for generations. The Rat Lines represent not only a physical escape, but also a symbolic flight from historical responsibility. They are a grim warning of how far the most perverse ideology of the 20th century managed to extend its tentacles even after its apparent defeat. They remind us that justice is not always immediate, that truth can be buried, though never completely, and that even in the darkest corners of the past, truths can emerge that shake the certainties of the present. The Nazi time travel theory, a twisted vision of temporal dominion. Of all the strange, disturbing, and at times unfathomable aspects of the ideological and scientific machinery of the Third Reich, few have generated such an intense aura of mystery as the persistent and enigmatic Nazi theory of time travel. Though considered by many as a mere curiosity born of speculation and science fiction, This idea has endured on the margins of history, fueled by lost documents, veiled testimonies, and the legacy of a Nazi obsession with conquering not only the visible world but also the most unfathomable frontiers of human knowledge. According to this controversial theory, high-ranking officials of the regime, particularly within the Schutzstaffel, SS, the ideological elite of Nazism, were not content with dominating physical space through war, but aspired to break the barriers of time. Through a strange convergence of advanced science, archaic occultism, and a fanatical quest for absolute power, the Nazis are said to have attempted access to alternate temporal dimensions, manipulating the laws of the universe in ways that defied all known logic. The core of these speculations lies in the interaction between certain scientific sectors of the regime and esoteric circles such as the enigmatic Vril Society, a mystical group credited with powerful influence over the early ideological concepts of the Third Reich. Inspired by ideas that fused ancient Germanic myths with pseudo-scientific theories, members of this group, according to accounts, believed that an ancestral energy called Vril could allow not only control over matter but also manipulation of space and time. For them, time was not a straight line but a malleable structure, and those who deciphered its secrets could travel through it, alter past events, or access possible futures. Although most modern scholars dismiss such claims due to lack of solid empirical evidence, history has not entirely erased the traces of these interests. It is true that the Nazis carried out radical experiments in facilities such as Wewelsburg Castle, the spiritual headquarters of the SS, or the hidden laboratories of the Wunderwaffe program, where experimental weapons with technology ahead of their time were developed. In these environments, the boundaries between science and superstition often blurred, making it difficult to separate reality from the mythology carefully crafted by the regime itself. Some declassified documents after the war, testimonies from captured scientists, and Allied intelligence reports vaguely mention research into magnetic fields, energy portals, and devices that more closely resembled futuristic concepts than conventional weaponry. Among them is the mythical project known as Die Glocke, the Bell, a supposed machine developed by Nazi scientists that, according to some versions, produced strange effects on time and gravity. Although the actual existence of this device has never been confirmed, its legend has fueled dozens of theories about the search for a technology that could break the laws of physics. The idea that the Nazi regime, in its final days, desperate to reverse its inevitable fall, might have tried to alter time itself to change the course of history sounds like a fable. However, that same desperation, combined with a messianic ideology and an almost religious faith in science as a tool of absolute domination, leaves open a disturbing question. How far were they willing to go? The debate about these experiments remains active. Were they mere pseudo-scientific delusions of a desperate regime, or incomplete fragments of real but lost research? If Nazi Germany even came close to grasping the fundamental concepts we now associate with quantum physics, temporal manipulation, or parallel dimensions, the implications would be extraordinary. Not only would they have tried to rewrite history, but they would have attempted to rewrite the very nature of reality. Although official history places these ideas on the margins as mere curiosities or dark legends, the legacy of these pursuits reminds us that knowledge, when combined with fanaticism, can give rise to ambitions that challenge not only morality but also the fabric of the universe. And if, as some believe, much remains to be discovered in sealed archives, forgotten bunkers, and lost testimonies, then perhaps the true scope of the Nazi project has never been fully understood. The Nazi super soldiers, the quest for a limitless force. The Third Reich's obsession with racial supremacy was not limited to genetic manipulation or eugenic selection. Its vision of a superior race went beyond the bounds of biological inheritance to venture into an even darker terrain, the artificial creation of the perfect warrior. A figure embodying the ideal of the Übermensch, the Nietzschean Superman reinterpreted by Nazism as the ultimate soldier, invulnerable to fear, insensitive to pain, ruthlessly effective in combat, and absolutely loyal to the Führer. This relentless pursuit translated into a series of deeply disturbing human experiments and medical developments that did not fully come to light until the war ended and Allied forces gained access to the Reich's camps, archives, and hidden laboratories. For years, Nazi doctors and scientists, many of them recruited for their total lack of ethical scruples, conducted atrocious tests on prisoners in concentration camps. These experiments, which violated every principle of humanity, ranged from prolonged exposure to sub-zero temperatures to mutilations, tests with pathogens, and surgeries without anesthesia. But among the most sinister and least understood was the program aimed at exploring the physiological and psychological limits of the human being with a specific goal: to develop a Nazi super soldier. The concept of the super soldier was not mere propaganda fantasy. Documents recovered after the war revealed that the regime, convinced that final victory required more than conventional training, had invested in research aimed at maximizing the average soldier's endurance, strength, aggression, and cognitive ability. The goal was clear: to shape the ideal combatant capable of operating for days without rest, displaying excessive aggression on the battlefield, and withstanding physical pain and emotional stress without breaking down. One of the most notorious aspects of this project was the systematic administration of chemical substances to alter the physical and mental performance of the troops. Among these substances, one drug stood out in particular: pervitin, a methamphetamine compound widely distributed among the German armed forces. Initially presented as a simple stimulant, pervitin became a silent pharmacological weapon that transformed thousands of soldiers into temporarily sleepless war machines, insensitive to fear and endowed with an almost inexhaustible artificial energy. During the early blitzkrieg campaigns, especially in Poland and France, pervitin's effectiveness was praised by military high command. Entire columns of soldiers marched without rest for days, with an aggression and drive that seemed superhuman. However, the side effects of this dependency were devastating. Physical collapses, psychotic episodes, hallucinations, extreme paranoia, and a surge in violent behavior within the ranks. Many soldiers who survived the war were left with irreversible addiction and mental after-effects that persisted for decades. And even so, the most chilling aspect of the project was not the use of drugs, but the underlying intention. The Nazis were not merely trying to enhance the soldier, they aimed to redesign the human being. They believed that through a combination of chemistry, surgery, extreme psychology, and ideological conditioning, they could eradicate weakness and replace it with absolute obedience and limitless ferocity. Some later reports suggest that there were plans, never completed, to neurologically modify soldiers or apply mind control techniques based on sensory deprivation, repetitive suggestion, and hormonal manipulation. The revelation of these programs after the fall of the Third Reich left the world stunned. These were not merely war crimes, but a deeply distorted vision of human potential, where science was used as a tool of dehumanization and medicine as an instrument of domination. The Nazi ideal of the super soldier represented the peak of an ideology that was not content with exterminating those it deemed inferior, but aspired to manufacture from scratch its new masters of the world. Today, the echoes of that dark ambition still resonate. The declassified archives, the testimonies of victims, and the remnants of the laboratories in places like Dachau or Ravensbrück remind us that science, stripped of ethics, can become a vehicle of horror. and that in the madness of the Third Reich, the pursuit of the perfect soldier was, in reality, the construction of the perfect monster. The Nazi quest for anti-gravity technology. In the darkest years of the Third Reich, as battles on the front became increasingly desperate, the Nazi leadership intensified its obsessive search for technological solutions that could change the course of the war. Among the most unsettling projects to emerge from this frenzy for technical supremacy was the exploration of an idea that, even today, seems more suited to science fiction than military history: the possibility of developing anti-gravity technology. Driven by a mix of strategic desperation and an ideology that glorified absolute domination, the regime's leaders gave free rein to radical theories that were, at the time, completely unexplored by the rest of the world. They believed that control of airspace would not be achieved simply with faster airplanes or better bombers, but through a total revolution in the conception of aeronautics. Thus was born one of the most enigmatic proposals of the Nazi scientific apparatus: the use of anti-gravitational fields to create unprecedented aircraft. This vision was not just an eccentric dream. Some documents and testimonies obtained after the war suggest that certain German scientists, especially those linked to the SS and occultist societies such as the Thule Society and the Vril Society, were developing experimental designs for advanced propulsion vehicles based on theoretical principles that defied known laws of physics. At the heart of these investigations was the idea that certain electromagnetic fields could alter gravitational interaction, thus allowing for the takeoff and navigation of craft without the need for traditional combustion engines. One of the most notorious projects associated with this line of thought was the so-called Die Glocke, the bell, a secret machine whose existence has been widely debated by researchers and historians. According to declassified reports and the testimony of some witnesses, Die Glocke was a metallic bell-shaped structure surrounded by intense magnetic fields and unknown substances, supposedly designed to experiment with propulsion effects, levitation, and even time manipulation. Although there is no conclusive evidence that these experiments produced functional results, what is truly disturbing is how far the Third Reich was willing to push the boundaries of rational knowledge to gain a definitive advantage. The idea that a totalitarian power could access a technology that completely nullified the limitations of conventional flight and gave rise to a new kind of uncontrollable aerial warfare is not only unsettling, but deeply revealing of the messianic and apocalyptic nature of Nazi ideology. Had it materialized even partially, this technology would have redefined not only battlefields but the global balance of power. It is not hard to imagine the terror that would have been caused by the appearance of silent craft with impossible maneuverability, capable of penetrating enemy lines with total impunity. The very concept of air defense would have become obsolete. Beyond the military realm, the potential use of such a technology in the hands of a regime bent on world domination would have had incalculable consequences for humanity. Even today, decades after the defeat of the Third Reich, echoes of those investigations still resonate. The mystery persists. How far did the Nazis really go in their pursuit of anti-gravity? How much of what was destroyed or disappeared in the regime's final days might have contained secrets that remain hidden? And the most disturbing question of all, was this technology merely pseudo-scientific fantasy or the first glimpse of a technological era yet to come? The case of Nazi anti-gravity remains one of the most enigmatic episodes of the Second World War. A shadow between science and myth that reminds us that when science is subordinated to fanaticism, it can become a tool of nightmare. The Black Sun, a Nazi occult secret society. In the deepest layers of the Third Reich's ideological apparatus, beyond the military machinery and political propaganda, there pulsed a far more disturbing force, an almost religious obsession with the occult. This interest was neither marginal nor incidental, but an active and deliberate dimension of the thinking of some of the principal architects of Nazism, especially figures like Heinrich Himmler, who saw in ancient esoteric beliefs a path to the construction of an eternal empire. Among all the symbols and secret societies that emerged within this fascination, none proved as enigmatic and disturbing as the so-called Black Sun Society. The Black Sun, or Schwarze Sonne, as it was known in German, was not simply an arcane emblem embedded in the floor of Wewelsburg Castle, the ceremonial headquarters of the SS. It was conceived as a symbolic portal to ancestral knowledge that, according to certain esoteric circles within the regime, granted access to a forgotten power. Its image, formed by 12 rays or sigils intertwined in a hypnotic spiral, evoked primordial energy, cyclical time, and the promise of an Aryan rebirth beyond conventional history. The cult of the Black Sun was much more than a marginal superstition. The SS, in its most esoteric branch, incorporated it as part of a symbolic body that fused Germanic mysticism, astrology, ancient runes, and initiation rituals. Himmler dreamed of creating an elite military clergy, inspired both by the Knights Templar and ancient Nordic tribes, and saw in the Black Sun the spiritual axis of that new order. Wewelsburg Castle, remodeled as a sacred temple, was to become the mystical center of the world once the German victory had been achieved. Its halls, decorated with runic motifs and mythological figures, were used in secret ceremonies that combined military hierarchy with occult symbolism. Behind this symbol also lay an intricate network of ideological influences, where groups like the Thule Society and the Vril Society converged. The former, a nationalist and occultist organization, was one of the intellectual incubators of National Socialism, promoting ideas of Aryan supremacy based on mythological and pseudo-archaeological interpretations of a glorified Germanic past. The latter, more shrouded in the mist of myth than in documented reality, supposedly believed in a universal energy source, Vril, that could be used to transform the human being and lead them toward a higher, almost divine state. The connections between these societies, esoteric symbols, and Nazi ideology have been the subject of study, debate, and even fascination by historians, researchers, and writers for decades. Although many aspects remain wrapped in mystery and speculation, it is certain that the Nazi regime did not hesitate to explore and exploit these ideas as tools to reinforce its narrative of power, destiny, and racial transcendence. The revelation of these practices at the end of the war surprised even the Allied forces. Documents, artifacts, and ritual spaces discovered in castles, laboratories, and Nazi archives reflected a worldview that combined pseudoscience, political fanaticism, and ancestral mysticism. The true horror did not reside solely in the regime's material crimes, but also in the spiritual and symbolic dimension through which they sought to justify and eternalize their totalitarian project. The legacy of the Black Sun continues to disturb even today, not only because of its dark aesthetic and symbolic weight, but because it represents one of the most extreme attempts of the 20th century to merge political power with archetypal myth, science with superstition, and technology with magic. Within it is condensed the regime's attempt to sacralize its domination, transforming ideology into religion and war into ritual. Hitler's doomed last resistance, the myth of the Alpine fortress. As the Third Reich wavered in its final days in early 1945, a dark and disturbing rumor began to circulate persistently through the halls of Allied intelligence agencies. According to certain reports, Hitler and the most loyal core of his regime were not planning to surrender or flee abroad. Instead, they were allegedly preparing a last stand, desperate but deadly, in the heart of the Alps. This supposed strategy, known among analysts as the Alpine Fortress or Alpenfestung, sparked considerable fear among high-ranking Allied commanders. According to available information, partly from interceptions, partly from deserters' testimonies and fragments of Nazi propaganda. The plan consisted of retreating to a vast network of tunnels, fortified shelters, and bunkers carved into the Bavarian and Austrian mountains. These hidden complexes were said to contain vast stockpiles of weapons, provisions, fuel, and even experimental technology. There, in the isolated and impenetrable alpine terrain, the most fanatical SS could regroup, plan ambushes, launch sabotage campaigns, and prolong the war indefinitely in the form of brutal guerrilla warfare. The very concept of this last stronghold of Nazism held a powerful symbolic appeal. The image of a wounded but undefeated Reich entrenched in the mountains like ancient Germanic warriors, ready to drag Europe into a long and bloody agony. Allied strategists concerned about the possibility of a war of attrition in difficult terrain and with thousands of soldiers still willing to die for Hitler could not completely dismiss the threat. The idea that the regime could hold out for months or even years after the fall of Berlin, plunging the continent into a never-ending nightmare, was a constant source of alarm. Nazi propaganda actively fueled this perception. In the Reich's final months, German media promoted the image of a fanatical mountain resistance, an impregnable fortress where the spirit of National Socialism would survive despite military defeat. They spoke of secret weapons, endless tunnels beneath the rocks, hidden training camps and bases ready to launch a counter-offensive. All of it served both to instill fear in the enemy and to keep hope alive among the regime's most radical supporters. However, when Allied forces finally advanced into the Alps after the fall of Berlin, what they found was not an active fortress, but scattered remnants. Some depots, isolated bunkers, abandoned documentation, and unfinished defensive structures. The Alpenfestung largely turned out to be a myth, a combination of propaganda, strategic paranoia, and the desperate illusions of Nazi leaders. Nevertheless, the mere fact that this possibility had been taken so seriously for weeks revealed the Third Reich's ability to generate fear even in its death throes. The myth of the Alpine fortress has endured as a symbol of the psychological terror that the Nazi regime managed to exert until its final moments. It also stands as a disturbing reminder, even when a dictatorship appears to collapse, its vestiges, ideological, military, or symbolic, can continue casting shadows that obscure history and sow doubts about the future. The Nazi quest for the Ark of the Covenant, a religious artifact of unimaginable power. In their relentless crusade for absolute supremacy, the Nazi regime did not limit itself to the development of advanced technologies or cutting-edge weaponry. In the shadows of its totalitarian ideology, there existed an older, more primitive, and in many ways more disturbing impulse: the obsession with the hidden power contained in legendary artifacts, relics from remote times which, according to certain traditions, could alter the course of history if they fell into the wrong hands. Of all these objects sought with near mystical fervor, none inspired as much fear and awe as the Ark of the Covenant. This mythical chest, described in the Bible as the container of the tablets of the law given to Moses on Mount Sinai, was more than a religious symbol for the fanatics of Nazism. It was attributed supernatural powers, the ability to destroy enemy armies, bring down impregnable walls, and grant divine strength to whoever possessed it. In Judeo-Christian mythology, the Ark was the physical manifestation of God's presence among men. For the Nazis, especially for Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS and architect of many of the regime's darkest paths, it represented a key to absolute spiritual power. Himmler was not only a ruthless strategist, but also a man deeply immersed in occultism. He believed that the fate of the Third Reich was tied to mystical forces that could be awakened and mastered through ancient rituals, esoteric symbols, and sacred objects. Convinced that Christianity had originated from corrupted ancient Germanic traditions, Himmler organized archaeological and esoteric expeditions across the world, from Tibet to North Africa, with the purpose of recovering remnants of a supposed lost ancestral knowledge. Among those secret missions, one of the most ambitious was the search for the Ark of the Covenant. Declassified reports after the war reveal that under the auspices of the SS, significant human and financial resources were mobilized for this endeavor. Agents, archaeologists, and specialists in ancient religions were sent to explore regions such as Egypt, Ethiopia, and the Middle East, where legends suggested possible locations of the Ark. The goal was not merely scientific or historical, it was a search charged with messianic fervor. Himmler believed that if the Third Reich obtained the Ark, its power would be legitimized by a transcendental dimension, and its victory would become a manifestation of destiny. The very fact that a modern regime dedicated time, money, and lives to pursue an object that represents the spiritual heart of Judaism, the very people the Nazis were systematically trying to exterminate, reveals a level of moral and symbolic contradiction that is deeply chilling. For the researchers who, after the war, confronted the SS's secret archives and the ruins of their research centers, the impact was twofold. Not only was the scale of the crimes perpetrated evident, but also the almost delusional scope of their spiritual ambitions. What would have happened if they had succeeded? What might it have meant for the world if a genocidal regime had taken possession of an artifact that millions of believers consider sacred? The manipulation of religious symbols for totalitarian purposes not only defies all rational logic, but also raises philosophical and theological questions about the use of myth and the sacred as tools of domination. The story of the Nazi search for the Ark is a terrifying reminder of how ideology, when combined with fanaticism and pseudoscience, can cross the boundaries of reason and attempt to rewrite even the spiritual foundations of humanity.